Before we begin, Galactic Horrors is now on Patreon. Get daily stories in one place, with no ads and no interruptions. Link is in the description or search Galactic Horrors on Patreon. Now, let's begin the transmission. The bone field still stopped me cold every morning. I stood on the service road switchbacking down from the plateau, pressure suit sealed, visor tinted against the amber wash of the twin stars, and looked out across 3 square kilometers of exposed skeleton. 17 megaliths rose from the excavation floor at staggered depths, each one a cathedral of bone half buried in pale calciumite crust and lit from every angle by industrial floods on scaffold towers. The towers ran around the clock, which on Coronis 7b meant every hour of every day. The binary suns kept the sky locked in permanent amber twilight, too dim for excavation work and too bright for darkness. We occupied a world frozen halfway through a sunset that would never finish. Down in the basin, the native mats had already opened for the light cycle. Grey-green films covered the flats between excavation roads, fine as mildew from a distance. Up close, they were alive with hair-thin cilia and pale root fans that flexed whenever our boots trembled the ground. 11 weeks in, I had learned to step around them when I could. Habit, mostly. On hostile worlds, any organism tough enough to survive deserved a little room. I started down the switchback toward the basin floor. My name is Ray Caldwell. 15 years running extraction operations on hostile environment worlds, ice moons, sulfur flats, pressure-crushed ocean rigs. And none of that had prepared me for Coronis. The megaliths looked like rib cages and spinal columns from animals so large the word animal stopped meaning anything. Fused arches of calcite composite rose 40 meters from their burial trenches. Branching internal channels, which the science team called marrow lines, ran through the structures in networks wide enough to crawl through on hands and knees. Structural buttresses thicker than highway pylons locked them into the surrounding rock. Every survey probe Palladian Resource Group had sent here over the past decade returned the same data. Anomalous calcium phosphate formations, clearly engineered, with no identifiable biological origin. Palladian, the mining and resource conglomerate that owned our contracts and our oxygen supply, classified Coronis 7b as a first-contact xenoarchaeology site and spent 2 years assembling the funding, permits, academic partnerships, and ground crew. My job was simpler than the science and uglier than the brochures. Manage the excavation, decide where the drills went, how deep, in what order, and keep 23 researchers and technicians breathing in a methane-nitrogen atmosphere 62 light-years from the nearest hospital. There was already talk of Phase 2. A second-wave vessel, the Harlan Briggs, waited at the Callaway platform with a larger deployment team if Palladian decided the site justified scaling. Tierney called it responsible operational continuity. I called it corporate hunger with a flight plan. "Caldwell, you on the floor yet?" Jesse Barlow's voice came through my helmet radio. Barlow ran drilling operations, a stocky man who had spent 20 years boring holes in difficult planets and treated every new contract like a plumbing problem. 5 minutes out, I said. "How's the rig at 12? "Warmed up and waiting. Foss wants that deep cut today. Sonar's clean. Chamber wall looks solid at 38 meters. I approved it last night. Start prep. I'll sign off when I get there." I crossed the basin toward Megalith 6, where our portable field laboratory sat in a pressurized shelter bolted to the rock. Dr. Martin Foss, the expedition's osteologist and comparative anatomist, had asked me to stop by before the morning drill schedule began. Foss was a careful man, thin, precise, uncomfortable with small talk, visibly irritated by anything that interrupted his sample work, and he didn't call meetings without reason. Inside the shelter, Foss had his analysis screens arranged on the fold-out bench, suit gloves off, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He looked as if he had been working since before the current light cycle, which on Coronis meant he could have been there for 12 hours or 30. "Caldwell," he said. "Sit down." I'll stand. What have you got? He pulled up a molecular comparison chart. 2 protein chain models side by side. The left was labelled Megalith 6, sample 14C. The right read terrestrial mammalian collagen, reference. I've been running fibre analysis on the deep core samples from 6 for 2 weeks, Foss said. The structural protein in the megaliths, what we've been calling the calcite composite, is built on a collagen analogue, long-chain protein fibres, triple helix configuration. You told me that at the last briefing. I told you it was a collagen analogue. I've refined the analysis. He tapped the 2 models. The folding patterns are close, Caldwell. Closer than they have any right to be. The amino acid sequencing shares over 40% overlap with mammalian collagen. Earth mammalian collagen. If I had received this sample without context in my lab back home, I would have flagged it as a contaminated terrestrial specimen before I considered any other explanation. I studied the 2 models. The structural similarity was visible even to me, and molecular biology sat 3 disciplines away from my training. You're saying these structures are related to Earth biology? I'm saying the base protein architecture shares too many features with terrestrial collagen for convergent evolution to explain it. We are 62 light-years from Earth, looking at structures that are clearly millions of years old. Foss pulled off his glasses and set them on the bench. I don't have an explanation. I have data that concerns me, and I wanted you to see it before we breach 12's interior chamber today. For a moment, the suit fans seemed too loud. Foss was a disciplined scientist, and disciplined scientists don't chase ghosts. If the data concerned him, the data was real. But I had 23 people to keep alive, a drill schedule to manage, and a corporate liaison who would want to know why his morning report was late if I spent the next hour staring at protein chemistry. Keep running the analysis, I said. I want hard numbers by end of cycle, something I can put in front of Tierney if it goes anywhere. Noel Tierney shouldn't be the first person to see this. Noel Tierney is the first person who sees everything. That's his contract and ours. Foss did not answer. I left the shelter and crossed back toward the main drill site at Megalith 12. The basin floor crunched under my boots. Calciumite regolith, brittle and pale, ground from the same mineral family as the megaliths themselves. The industrial floods threw hard white light across the excavation, and in the permanent amber and white crosshatch, the megaliths cast double shadows in opposite directions. 12 was the largest structure in the basin, a curving wall of fused ribs arching 60 meters above the dig line, marrow channels branching through its interior like river tributaries frozen in bone. My suit radio beeped. Dennis Grady, our environmental technician, was monitoring from the atmospheric station up at base camp on the plateau. Caldwell, got something for the log. Sensors at sites 3 and 6 are showing a small uptick in free oxygen, 4 parts per million above baseline. Instrument drift? Could be. Both sensors moved the same direction though, and neither showed it at last calibration. Might be off-gassing from fresh drill cores. I'm logging it. Flag me if it shifts again. 4 parts per million. On a world whose atmosphere would kill an unprotected human in 40 seconds, 4 parts per million was noise. Still, after Foss's chart, I felt the number settle somewhere behind my sternum. Barlow had the drill rig positioned at the base of Megalith 12, a 3-ton rotary corer designed for hard rock environments. Its cutting assembly, angled for a bore path that would intercept the interior chamber sonar, had mapped. A void space roughly 8 meters across, sealed inside the structure at a depth of 38 meters. The rig bit into megalith bone with a sound that 11 weeks had not made tolerable. The cutting head threw up white powder and long curling shavings of calcite composite, and the shavings spiraled off the bit like bone chips from surgical machinery. "Ready on your word," Barlow said. I checked the rig telemetry, confirmed the bore angle and reviewed the sonar overlay one more time. Clean margins, stable surrounding structure, sealed void dead ahead. "Full depth at standard rate," I said. "Pull back and seal if the chamber pressure reads anything over ambient." Barlow engaged the corer. The cutting head screamed into Megalith 12, and the scaffold holding the rig shuddered as the assembly took full load. I stood in the shadow of a bone cathedral and watched my people drill into something that had been sealed for longer than our species had existed, and the operation felt almost routine. That was the danger. 11 weeks of inert bone, stable readings, patched suits and generator checks had turned wonder into procedure. Magnificent, enormous, inexplicable bone had become part of the workday. The drill reached the chamber wall 6 hours later. The telemetry alarm chirped at the same moment the ground lurched under my boots. The whole basin floor shuddered. I grabbed the scaffold railing. Grady came through on the radio, voice sharp, clipped, reporting seismic spikes across the sensor grid. The drill rig stalled as the cutting assembly punched through into the chamber void and lost purchase. "Kill it," I told Barlow. "Pull the assembly back." Barlow shut the rig down, and his crew scrambled off the scaffold. The first tremor lasted maybe 8 seconds, subsided, then returned as a deeper vibration that travelled through the regolith and up through my boot soles into my knees. Then Megalith 12 moved. The first sign was sound, a cracking report, massive and structural, the noise of stone and bone breaking apart under internal pressure. It came from the upper arches 60 meters above the drill site, where the megalith's ribs had been locked in compressed sediment since before the Cambrian explosion. Soil and crust broke away from the upper surfaces in sheets, crashing down the structure's flanks in rivers of calciumite dust and shattered rock. A dislodged slab struck one floodlight tower at the base and folded 2 of its legs. I opened the general channel. "All personnel clear the basin floor around 12, every direction, full withdrawal, right now. Use the switchback roads. Do not cross open ground towards 6 or 9. We ran. Barlow and his drill team sprinted for the nearest access road. I followed, looking back over my shoulder as the sound built behind us. The ribs were opening. The arches, each one 40 meters long and wider than a 2-lane road, cracked free of the surrounding crust and began to rise. They lifted in matched pairs, left and right, spreading outward from the central spine the way a rib cage spreads when something enormous draws its first breath after a sleep older than terrestrial life. Rock and compacted soil fell away in landslides. The movement was slow, grinding, accompanied by a deep register groan of stressed bone composite that I felt in my sternum more than I heard through my helmet speakers. Fluid moved inside the structure. The marrow channels Foss had been sampling for weeks filled with something warm enough to throw visible vapor where broken ends vented into the alien atmosphere. White plumes jetted from ruptured channel terminations all along the rising ribs. The gas caught the floodlight beams and turned them into bright columns against the amber sky. Grady's voice cracked on the radio. "Caldwell, I'm reading. The gas from those vents is oxygen. High purity O2, warm, humidified, coming out at volume. Temperature inside 200 meters of 12 just jumped 9 degrees in 4 minutes and it's still climbing." We reached the access road and stopped on the switchback. 17 people in pressure suits stood along the gravel track, chests heaving, watching Megalith 12 finish its transformation above us. The ribs locked into their final positions with a concussive boom that sent dust geysers erupting from the basin floor. The structure stood fully open, a skeletal canopy of curved bone arches spread wide against the twilight sky. Marrow channels venting steady plumes of warm gas into an atmosphere that would kill us without our suits. Barlow stood beside me, suit fans working hard. "What did we hit in there?" "I don't know yet. My rig is under that thing. If the rubble, Jesse, the rig doesn't matter right now." Below us, inside the radius of the venting gas, the ground was already changing. The calciumite crust nearest the megalith's base had darkened with condensed moisture. The grey-green mats were turning brown from the centre outward, their cilia stiffening, their pale root fans curling back into the soil. Something in the vented atmosphere was killing them on contact. Noel Tierney arrived on the observation road 20 minutes later, slightly winded, his recording tablet already active. Palladian's corporate liaison was a trim man in his late 40s who had practiced looking composed during emergencies until the composure became permanent. He surveyed the open megalith, the venting gas, the browning mats and the buried drill rig. His first breath fogged the inside of his visor. Then he steadied himself. This is going to rewrite every valuation model the company built for this site. The structure activated, Noel. It's pumping gas. I need to understand what triggered the reaction before anyone goes near it again. Absolutely. But we should get the documentation team on the perimeter while conditions are fresh. A functioning alien machine, Caldwell. Do you understand what that represents commercially? I understand that the ground shifted hard enough to drop a floodlight tower. I want a full seismic survey before anyone crosses the 200-meter line. He paused, calculated, nodded. Seismic survey first, then documentation. I'll transmit a preliminary report to the Kermode. The Kermode was our orbiting support vessel, Palladian-owned, crewed by company men, and the only communication relay between us and corporate headquarters. Tierney walked back toward the base camp transmitter, already composing his report as he moved. I watched him go and said nothing about the thing turning in the back of my mind. We had breached a chamber and completed a circuit. Foss confirmed the shape of it an hour later. We stood across the bench from each other in the field shelter while he walked through Grady's atmospheric data, one screen at a time. The vented gas is an oxygen-nitrogen mix, Foss said. 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, trace argon and carbon dioxide. Humidity averaging 64%. Temperature at the vent exits is holding steady at 18 degrees Celsius. I waited. That ratio, Foss said, with that humidity and temperature envelope, is functionally terrestrial sea-level atmosphere, close enough that an unprotected human could breathe it comfortably. Through the shelter viewport, I could see Megalith 12 against the amber sky. Its ribs spread wide, white plumes rising in steady columns from its marrow channels. The gas drifted outward in a visible haze, pooling in the lower terrain around the structure's base. Inside that haze, the native biology was dying. There is no credible mechanism, Foss said, by which an alien structure on a methane-nitrogen world would produce the exact atmospheric mix required by Homo sapiens, unless Homo sapiens was part of the design premise. I looked back at the data. How fast is the oxygen zone growing? Grady has it at a 200-meter radius from 12's center, expanding roughly 30 meters per hour. At that rate, it reaches base camp within the next 2 cycles. And the trigger? Foss moved to a second display. Chamber pressure, bore depth telemetry, oxygen uptick, seismic onset. The small oxygen anomalies before the breach suggest the structure was already responding to human presence. Low-level response. A probe state, perhaps. But when the drill opened the sealed chamber, the system appears to have shifted into full activation. Human signature plus internal access. That would be my working hypothesis. He looked through the viewport at 12. We didn't wake it by touching it, Caldwell. We told it we had arrived. The collapse happened during the next rest period. The ground surrounding Megalith 12 had been compromised since activation. Hairline fractures in the basin wall, subsidence along the drill roads, small rockfalls from the exposed strata above. Grady flagged the instability 3 times. I ordered perimeter markers and closed the eastern approach road. But the basin wall kept its own schedule. Deep into what passed for a sleep shift on a planet that never went dark. A 40-meter section of the eastern wall sheared free and dropped into the excavation in a roaring cascade of broken crust and pulverized stone. The concussion woke half the camp. I was in the operations shelter reviewing Foss's updated protein analysis when the seismic alarm shrieked and the floor jolted under my chair. By the time the dust cleared and Grady's instruments confirmed no further slides, the basin wall had opened a raw wound in the planet's geological record. The landslide had scraped away millions of years of compressed sediment and exposed a buried stratum roughly 30 meters below the original surface, a band of darker, denser rock that ground-penetrating sonar immediately lit up with structural returns. Dense, linear features, parallel, regular, extending along the exposed face for the full length of the collapse zone. Something built. Something purposeful. We went down at the start of the next work cycle. I brought Foss, 2 technicians named DeWitt and Larkin, and a portable scanner rig. Barlow wanted to come, but I needed him assessing damage to the drill equipment. Tierney attached himself to the survey party without asking permission. The descent from the fresh collapse edge to the exposed stratum took 20 careful minutes over loose rubble and fractured slabs. The air was different down there. Megalith 12's oxygen zone had expanded overnight, and my suit's external sensors showed the temperature running 6 degrees above baseline. We were walking through the outer edge of the terraformed region where breathable gas mixed with the thin native atmosphere in an unstable gradient. A patch of living mat clung to the shadowed side of a fallen slab. Its cilia still moved, dragging slowly through condensation like wet hair. When my bootstep vibrated the stone, the root fans tried to open. They got halfway and stopped. Then they browned. I kept walking. The linear features resolved as we approached. Trenches, cut into the dark substrate, reinforced with a silicate composite I had never encountered in any survey catalogue. Dark green, dense, shaped with tool marks that bore no resemblance to the megalith's organic architecture. Each trench was roughly 3 meters deep and 2 meters across, with firing steps carved into the inner walls and reinforced parapets along the forward lip. They ran in staggered parallel lines, connected by narrower communication channels at regular intervals. A defensive network. Layered, mutually supporting, professionally engineered by someone who understood fortification, and all of it faced upward, toward the surface, toward the megaliths. Different fabrication from the bone structures entirely, Foss said. He was already crouching at the trench wall, running his gloved fingers along the green composite reinforcement. The tool signatures are smaller, finer. Whoever built this was working at a different physical scale than whatever produced the megaliths. Defensive positions, I said. The layout was plain to anyone who had studied military engineering. Someone was trying to hold ground against something coming from above. That would be the logical reading. Foss straightened and looked toward the nearest breach in the trench wall, where the landslide had cracked open the forward parapet and scattered rubble across the trench floor. He went quiet. "Caldwell, come look at what's packed in here." I crossed to the breached section and looked down into the trench. The floor was dense with remains. Hundreds of small ovoid shapes, each roughly the size of a rugby ball, lay embedded in the compacted sediment that had filled the trench over the intervening millennia. Where the collapse had cracked the ovoids open, I could see what they held. Skeletons. Small, the size of a 10-year-old child, but with proportions that belonged to a fully grown adult. Compact skulls with heavy brow ridges, thick limb bones, hands curled tight against drawn-up knees. Each skeleton was folded inside its ovoid casing, and the casing material was something I recognized on sight. The same calcite and marrow composite as the megaliths, seed pods, hard-shelled capsules of engineered bone, built to protect their cargo through atmospheric entry, impact or bombardment, and deposit it intact on arrival. The pods had cracked. The skeletons inside were frozen mid-emergence, jaws open, limbs half extended, caught in the act of hatching out of their casings into the trench, into the defensive line of whoever had built these fortifications to stop them. The suit handled moisture balance automatically, but some primitive part of the body still knew when it wanted to be sick. "Martin," I said, keeping my tone measured because Tierney was 8 meters behind me and closing. "Get the portable assay kit down here." Foss was already working a bone fragment free from the nearest intact pod with a field extraction tool. His movements were faster than his usual careful pace. He knew. The shape of those skulls, The ratio of limb to torso, the configuration of the hands. We both recognized what we were seeing. But recognition by eye and confirmation by chemistry are different grades of certainty, and only one survives when someone demands proof. The assay took 40 minutes. Foss worked inside the trench itself, suit lights angled down into the packed remains, while I occupied Tierney with the structural survey of the defensive network. DeWitt and Larkin mapped the visible extent of the trench lines. They ran at least 300 meters in both directions along the exposed face, and sonar suggested they continued deep into the unexcavated strata beyond. Foss called me over on a private radio channel. The bone is human, Homo sapiens. The proportions are compressed. These were engineered variants, smaller, denser, built for a constrained physical envelope, but the protein markers fall inside the modern human genome. The collagen structure matches the megalith samples within 2% deviation. These organisms and the megaliths were fabricated from the same biological foundation. How old? Mineral replacement in the bone matrix is consistent with deep-time fossilization, millions of years, same range as the megalith dating. I looked down the length of the trench at the hundreds of cracked pods and their small, curled occupants. Human bodies, engineered, miniaturized, packed inside shells of the same living bone that made up the colossal structures above us. Deployed against fortifications built by beings who saw them coming and dug in to fight. The picture is coherent, Foss said, voice low, private, meant only for my ears. Humans were present on this planet millions of years ago, delivered in biomechanical pods as part of an operation that included the megaliths. Something indigenous to this world built these trenches to resist them. And now the megaliths have detected us and started producing the exact atmosphere our bodies require. A boot scraped on loose rubble behind us. Tierney. Close enough to have caught the last exchange. His suit ran Palladian's corporate-grade communications package, and I had long suspected it could monitor local channel traffic regardless of privacy settings. Dr. Foss. Tierney's voice was smooth, administrative, almost gentle. I have to remind you that preliminary findings from this excavation site are governed by Section 14 of your expedition contract. Recordings, data, analysis, and interpretive conclusions require Palladian authorization before any distribution, internal or external. Noel, I said, we just pulled human remains out of a trench system that predates our entire species by geological ages. This is beyond your contract clause. This is exactly the situation Section 14 was written for. Anomalous findings with potential commercial or strategic value. His gaze flicked down to the broken pods, then away too quickly. Dr. Foss, I'll need your raw data. Assay results, spectrographic readings, field logs. They route through my office before anyone else receives them. Foss looked at Tierney with the expression he usually reserved for contaminated samples. Then he turned back to the trench, crouched beside the nearest cluster of pods, and resumed his survey without a word. My suit radio clicked to the general frequency. Grady strained and trying to keep his voice professional. Caldwell, you need to hear this right now. Megaliths 3 and 9 just started venting. Same oxygen signature as 12, same thermal profile, same expansion rate. And I'm picking up subsurface thermal shifts under 5 and 14. The whole basin is activating. I looked up from the trench, past the collapsed wall, toward the plateau, where the remaining megaliths stood in their excavation rows under the floodlights. 2 new columns of white gas rose against the amber sky, drifting outward from structures that had been inert stone an hour ago. The oxygen zone was widening across the basin floor. Everywhere it spread, the grey-green cover turned brown, curled, and died. The fissure opened 2 hours after the third megalith woke. Grady tracked it on the seismic grid, a subsurface fracture propagating outward from megalith 12's base, following one of the deep marrow channels that connected the structures below ground. The fracture split the basin floor 70 meters east of the trench site, venting a gust of warm, pressurized air that blew dust and loose calcium-ite 20 meters into the sky. When the rubble settled, A gap roughly 4 meters wide and 9 meters long had opened in the rock, sloping downward into darkness. I was at base camp when Grady called it in. Barlow was already pulling on his suit. "That's directly under the section we surveyed this morning," I said. "Under the trenches." "Sonar's showing a large void down there," Grady said. "Walled, sealed. Same composite signature as the megaliths. Something structural." I should have posted a perimeter and waited. I should have sent a remote probe. The ground was unstable. The megaliths were activating in sequence, and every hour the oxygen zone pushed farther across the basin, killing the native biosphere in an expanding ring. Waiting was the professional call, but the trenches and the seed pods and Foss's protein data had settled in my chest like a weight I could not shift by sitting in base camp reviewing atmospheric charts. Human presence was part of the mechanism. Human ignorance was now part of the danger. Every minute we spent without understanding the system was another minute the system used us correctly. Whatever was sealed below us might explain the rest. Barlow, 2 technicians and I descended through the fissure on rappel lines. The walls were raw, fractured stone for the first 6 meters, then transitioned abruptly into calcite and marrow composite, smooth, dense, warm to the touch even through suit gloves. Active marrow channels ran through the walls, carrying heat. At the bottom of the slope, a membrane of dried marrow tissue sealed the entrance to the void space beyond. Thick, brownish-grey, stretched across the passage like a drumhead. I approached to examine it. When I came within arm's reach, it split. The tear ran from top to bottom in a single clean line, the 2 halves curling back against the walls as if pulled by invisible hands. The membrane had detected me and opened. Warm air rushed from the space beyond, oxygen-rich, humid, 22 degrees on my suit gauges. The same engineered atmosphere the megaliths were pumping into the sky above, but concentrated, pressurized, maintained in this sealed vault for a span of time I could no longer think about in comfortable terms. The vault was enormous. Our suit lights swept across a chamber roughly 40 meters long and 20 wide. Every surface made of bone composite, the ceiling supported by arching ribs that mirrored the external architecture of the megaliths above ground. The marrow channels here were thicker, denser, branching across the walls and ceiling in networks that swelled and contracted with the slow movement of warm fluid. Lining every wall, embedded in honeycomb scaffolding of interlocking bone, were seed pods. Hundreds of them, intact, sealed, undamaged. Unlike the cracked and fossilized pods in the trenches above, these had been preserved in their vault, held at stable temperature, protected from the geological pressure that had crushed and mineralized their counterparts in the defensive lines. Each pod was the same ovoid shape, the same size, the same calcite marrow composite. Each one held a shadow visible through the translucent shell. "Thermal signatures," Barlow said. He checked his scanner. The display painted the vault walls in graduated color. "They're warming up, every single one." The marrow channels in the walls were feeding heat into the honeycomb scaffolding. The pods were absorbing it, their shells darkening from pale calcium white to a deeper, living cream as the internal temperature climbed. "We need to leave," I said. "Right now. Back up the lines." The first pod cracked before we reached the fissure. The sound was sharp and wet, the snap of something hard giving way under pressure from inside. Then another. Then a dozen at once, a rapid percussion of splitting shells running along the nearest wall in a chain reaction. The honeycomb scaffolding shifted and flexed as the pods opened. What came out of them moved fast. Small bodies, pale, hairless, slick with a film of warm marrow fluid. Compact frames with adult proportions compressed into a child's dimensions. The same morphology as the fossilized skeletons in the trenches, except alive, muscular, immediate. Wide jaws, heavy brow ridges, thick fingers that gripped the honeycomb scaffolding as the creatures pulled themselves free of their broken shells and oriented in the vault light. Their eyes were human, brown, focused, tracking. The nearest one fixed its gaze on me, opened its jaw, and made a sound, a low, rhythmic vocalization. 3 syllables repeated twice, tonal and structured. It was language-shaped, organized, and entirely beyond me. The creature dropped from the scaffolding and moved toward me, fast, fluid, balanced on the balls of its feet. It stopped 2 meters away and held position, watching my face. More pods cracked open along the walls. Dozens of the creatures emerged, pulling free, dropping to the vault floor, orienting immediately toward the 4 of us. They clustered around us in a loose formation, body heat radiating through my suit sensors, their eyes moving between our faces with an attention that looked like expectation. "They're drawn to us," Barlow said. His voice was controlled, professional, and I could hear the effort it cost him. "They're grouping on us like we're rally points. Don't touch them. Don't push them. Walk toward the fissure. Steady pace." We moved. The creatures moved with us, maintaining distance, matching our speed, keeping formation around our group as if we were a convoy they had been assigned to escort. Their coordination was precise and unlearned, the behavior of organisms built for this purpose and executing it for the first time after millions of years in suspension. Larkin stumbled on a broken pod shell and went down on one knee. 3 of the creatures shifted instantly, closing the gap, positioning themselves between Larkin and the empty vault behind him. Protective deployment. They watched the space he had left exposed, heads turning in small, synchronized movements, scanning for threats. Then a native ground crawler came through the fissure. The animal was one of Coronis 7b's indigenous surface species, segmented, low-slung, about 1 meter long, with a chitinous carapace and multiple jointed limbs. It had probably been disturbed by the fissure opening and wandered in following the heat gradient. It stopped at the bottom of the slope, antennae tasting the new air. 4 of the war organisms broke from our escort group and crossed the vault floor in a sprint. They hit the ground crawler at full speed. The violence was so fast and thorough that the animal was dead before it had time to retract its limbs. They tore through the carapace with their bare hands, using thickened finger bones as blades, and reduced the creature to scattered segments of chitin and wet tissue in under 10 seconds. Then they turned, jogged back to our group, and resumed their escort positions. Their hands were streaked with dark fluid. Their breathing was barely elevated. Their eyes found our faces again. "Get us out of this vault," Barlow said very quietly. "Please." We climbed. The creatures followed, scrambling up the fissure walls with a grip, strength and agility that made the rappel lines irrelevant. They spilled out onto the basin floor behind us, into the amber twilight and the spreading oxygen haze, and immediately fanned out in a perimeter around our group. Every native organism within their range died. Microbial mats, subsurface burrowers driven to the surface by the atmospheric shift, a cluster of ground crawlers near the trench site. They killed all of it, and after each kill the creatures returned to their positions around us. Larkin panicked. He pulled the cutting tool from his equipment belt, a short-range industrial laser used for sample extraction, and fired it at the nearest creature when it moved too close. The beam caught the organism in the chest. It dropped, twitching, the cauterized wound steaming in the warm air. It died in seconds. The other creatures stopped. Every one of them went motionless. They looked at the dead body, then at Larkin, then at each other, and the sound they made was something I will carry with me for the rest of my career. A low, confused keening, an almost human distress vocalization that rose and fell and communicated bewilderment more clearly than language. They did not attack Larkin. They pressed closer to the rest of us, tighter, more insistent, as if the death of one of their own meant the remaining humans needed additional protection. From the fissure below, more pods cracked open in the dark. Dozens, scores. The vault was emptying itself, and everything it held was coming up to join us. I made the decision to enter Megalith 12 within the hour. Foss argued against it. Barlow argued against it. Grady, from base camp, argued against it on the general channel. The war organisms were spreading across the basin floor in a widening cordon, and every megalith that had activated was drawing more of them to the surface through new fissures opening along the buried marrow networks. The safe, operational, professional decision was to evacuate to base camp, seal the habitats, and call the Kermode for orbital extraction. But the professional framework had collapsed. Our emergency protocols covered atmospheric breach, seismic events, equipment failure, and medical crisis. This had no protocol. The megaliths were keyed to human biology. The membrane had opened for me. The vault had warmed when we entered. The creatures had oriented on us like ordnance finding its guidance signal. If there was a mechanism inside the largest active structure that could explain the activation sequence, I needed to see it before I could make an evacuation recommendation that meant anything. I told myself that was the reason. Maybe it was. Maybe some part of me already understood that the system was changing the meaning of every human decision made on its surface. Curiosity, procedure, command responsibility, the need to know what came next. All of it might already belong to the machine. Foss came because the interior architecture was the only remaining data he could gather. Tierney came because Palladian's contract gave him documentation rights to everything found on the planet, and he intended to exercise them until someone physically removed him. The three of us entered Megalith 12 through the breach Barlow's drill had made, now widened by the structure's own unfolding, a ragged passage through 3 meters of bone, composite, into the interior void. The war organisms followed us to the entrance and stopped. They did not enter. They crouched at the threshold in a semicircle, watching us go inside, and their silence as we crossed into the megalith's body was worse than any sound they had made. The interior was a single space. Vast, vaulted, cathedral-proportioned, the inner surfaces of the unfolded ribs curving overhead to form a ceiling 50 meters above the bone floor. The marrow channels here were massive, as wide as my torso, running in vertical and diagonal tracks across every surface. Light from our suit lamps scattered off crystalline deposits in the bone walls and came back diffused, amber gold, as if the structure were generating its own twilight. The carvings covered every wall, cut into the bone surpassing any fabrication technique in the human archaeological record. The reliefs ran in sequential narrative panels from floor to ceiling, wrapping the entire circumference of the chamber. I saw them first as fragments. Tall beings, 3 meters or more, stylized but anatomically coherent, stood over vat-shaped structures, containment fields, and rows of biological specimens arranged for modification. The specimens were small, bipedal, proportioned like the creatures from the vault. Foss aimed his lamp and stopped breathing for 2 seconds. "That's the engineering phase," he said. His voice had stripped itself down to pure clinical function. The man behind it had retreated somewhere the data could not reach. "They're manufacturing the weapon stock, proto-human organisms." The next sequence showed deployment. The small bipedal figures were loaded into seed pods, the same ovoid shapes we had found in the trenches and the vault, and the pods were packed into launching structures aimed at the sky. Thousands of them in dense massed rows. The panels showed the pods descending onto a planetary surface, splitting open, the figures emerging into a landscape populated by other organisms. Native life, diverse, complex, carved with the same anatomical care as the builders themselves. The small figures swarmed through it, overwhelming it, tearing through the native ecosystem in coordinated waves. The central panel dominated the far wall, 15 meters across, rising nearly to the vaulted ceiling. I stood at its base and looked up, and the image carved there settled into my comprehension with the weight of something I would never be able to set down. Humans. Unmistakable. Full-sized, modern in their proportions. They descended from a dark sky onto a planet's surface in dense formations, like a swarm of locusts darkening the horizon, wave after wave. Below them, the planet's original inhabitants were small, scattered, overwhelmed, and dying. The native beings had built structures, they had tools, they had what looked like a civilization. The humans came down on top of it like a blight, carved above the swarm, directing the descent. The tall, multi-limbed builders watched from orbital platforms with the dispassionate attention of engineers observing a field test. "Oh God," Foss said. He stood beside me, lamp aimed at the upper register of the central panel, where the builders' orbital platforms hung above the invasion. They seeded us. The pods in the trenches were the first attempt on this world, the small variant weapon stock. When that failed, when the native population dug in and fought them off, the builders changed strategy. His lamp tracked to the rightmost panels, where a new sequence began. They planted the weapon genome on a remote world, gave it room to develop, intelligence, culture, tool use, spaceflight. He stopped. I already saw the next image, a distant planet, blue, oceanic, orbited by a single moon. Organisms growing, building, spreading across its surface in accelerating waves. Developing technology, ships, reaching outward, and finally, inevitably, finding their way back to the megaliths. The last panel showed a megalith unfolding, ribs spreading, marrow venting, with small human figures standing at its base, exactly where we stood now. Tierney was recording everything. His tablet swept across the walls in smooth, panning arcs, capturing every panel, every border notation, every line of the carved history. I watched him work and understood that he was documenting the blueprints for humanity's manufacture and deployment. For once, his face was not composed. The light from the wall caught moisture on his lower lashes. His mouth had parted slightly, and the tablet drifted downward by a few centimeters before he noticed and corrected it. Then the marrow channels brightened. The shift happened gradually, a deepening of the amber-gold light in the crystalline deposits, spreading from the channel junctions outward across the carved surfaces. The reliefs began to glow. Colour bled into the carved figures, pale flesh tones for the humans, darker greens and greys for the native species, a deep indigo for the builders. The geometric border notations between panels illuminated in sequence. The carved images began to move, bioluminescent animation. The entire history played across the walls of the cathedral in light and shadow. The engineering, the pod launches, the first deployment, the trench war, the failure, the long seeding strategy, the evolution on the distant blue world, the development of spaceflight, the return. The playback cycled through geological ages in minutes, each phase rendered in moving light on bone, and the chamber filled with a low harmonic resonance that built steadily in pitch and volume. The final sequence showed the megaliths activating. The playback light concentrated on the far wall, Megalith 12's own ribs spreading, gas venting, oxygen zone expanding. And then the image shifted to something new. A signal represented as a radiating geometric pattern broadcasting outward from the megalith's spire into space. At the edges of the pattern, other megaliths on other worlds responded, receiving, acknowledging, a network coming online across distances measured in light years, each node confirming that the weapon lineage had arrived and the program was running. The harmonic built to a peak. The chamber shook. Through the open ribcage above us, the spire at the top of Megalith 12 was visible against the amber sky. A column of pale light rose from it, coherent, vertical, climbing straight up through the atmosphere and into the space beyond. Grady's voice came through on the radio, fighting the vibration. "Caldwell, I'm picking up a directional transmission from 12's spire. Powerful, off the scale of anything our equipment can characterize. It's broadcasting outward, deep space trajectory. I can detect the frequency, but I've got nothing that can disrupt it or identify the encoding. A beacon. Broadcasting to other megalith installations across the galaxy that the weapon had matured, arrived under its own power, and activated the terraforming program exactly as designed. Foss sat down on the bone floor of the cathedral. He put his back against the carved wall, between a panel showing the builder's orbital platforms and a panel showing the blue planet where humanity had incubated. He pulled his knees up and pressed his gloved palms against his visor. His breathing was fast and shallow on the radio. "Everything we've done," he said. "Every migration, every colony ship, every probe sent to a new system. It's the program running, Caldwell. Every time our species looked up and wanted to go farther, that was the engineering expressing itself. We were built to spread. We were built to find these things and activate them. We're here because this is what we were manufactured to do." Tierney lowered his recording tablet. For 3 seconds, the only 3 seconds of the entire expedition, his face registered something like the beginning of real understanding. Fear, maybe. Grief, maybe. Then he blinked, reset, and raised the tablet again. "The commercial value of a functioning interstellar communication network," he said, voice thinner than before but steadying with every word, "is beyond any existing framework. Palladian will need to establish a new asset classification for this." I stared at him. The playback light moved across his visor in slow, repeating cycles, colouring his face with the history of our manufacture, and he was thinking about asset classifications because the alternative was understanding what he had helped wake. We walked out of the cathedral into air I could almost taste through my helmet seals. The basin had transformed. In the hours we had spent inside Megalith 12, the activation had cascaded across the entire field. 7 megaliths stood open now, their ribcages spread against a sky that had shifted colour, the amber haze thinning, replaced by a blue-white clarity that looked almost terrestrial. The twin suns hung in the brightening sky, distinct discs now instead of amber smears behind methane murk. The temperature outside my suit registered 20 degrees. Breathable oxygen concentration at ground level had crossed the threshold for unassisted human respiration. The native ecology was collapsing. Everywhere I looked, the grey-green mats that had covered the basin floor were blackened and peeling back from the rock. Their cilia lay flat in slick, dead whorls. The pale root fans had surfaced and withered, lying across the ground like beached worms. Ground-crawler carcasses dotted the landscape, curled and stiff. An entire biosphere that had survived on this world for hundreds of millions of years was dying in a radius that expanded with every hour of megalith operation. The war organisms from the vault had spread. Dozens of them occupied the basin in loose clusters, crouching motionless in the warm air, oriented toward base camp on the plateau above. They had killed everything non-human within operational range, and now waited in the stillness of completed purpose, watching the habitat modules where the rest of the crew had sealed themselves in, waiting for direction from a command structure that had been extinct for longer than human memory. I climbed to base camp. Foss followed in silence. Tierney walked behind us, still recording. Inside the operations shelter, I raised the Kermode on the long-range transmitter. Captain Morris answered from orbit, signal clear, tone carrying the wariness of a man who had been watching surface readings change for the past 12 hours and did not understand what he was seeing. "Captain, this is Caldwell. I need you to hold position and block all additional personnel from descent. Keep shuttles, crewed supply drops, and augmentation teams off the surface. More human bodies down here will accelerate the activation. Do you understand?" "I hear you, Caldwell. But I've got a problem. Palladian's Operations Center received Tierney's preliminary report 14 hours ago. They flagged Coronis 7B for priority development, and the Harlan Briggs departed the Callaway platform 6 hours ago with a full ground deployment, 212 personnel, ETA 11 days. The number went through me like voltage. 212 more bodies on a planet where human proximity was the activation trigger. Every one of them a key turning in a lock already open. "Can you signal the Briggs to hold at orbit? Keep them off the surface." "I can signal whatever you want, but the deployment order came from Palladian's board, and the Briggs' captain answers to corporate, same as I do." "Same as you do, Caldwell. If the board says land, they'll land. I closed the channel and turned to Tierney, who stood in the shelter doorway downloading his cathedral recordings to a portable drive. You knew, I said. Before we launched, Palladian knew the megaliths responded to human proximity. That's a mischaracterization of the pre-survey data. The classified pre-survey data. The data you didn't share with the dig team. What did Palladian's probes find, Noel? Tierney set down his tablet. The deep space probes registered localized atmospheric anomalies around certain megaliths, he said. Whenever a crude probe passed within a specific radius, the atmospheric composition in that radius shifted. Small changes. Oxygen uptick, temperature variance, humidity adjustment. The effect was consistent and repeatable. Unmanned probes produced no reaction. You knew the structures activated around humans. We knew human proximity triggered a measurable response. The mechanism was unknown. The nature of the structures was unknown. The preliminary interpretation was adaptive environmental modulation. You mean they made the air more comfortable for us? We did not know that. You knew enough to send bodies instead of machines. The response appeared to scale with the number of humans present. More personnel meant more data and faster characterization of the effect. Palladian recommended a larger ground crew on that basis, yes. I grabbed him by the front of his suit and pulled him forward. The shelter wall caught his back. Barlow, entering behind us, stopped in the doorway. You used us as triggers, I said. 23 people breathing and sweating next to alien machines calibrated to detect us. And you sent as many warm bodies as you could get approved because the machines perform better with a bigger sample. The expedition charter was transparent about crew size recommendations. Every member signed informed consent documentation. The specific nature of the pre-survey data was classified at the corporate level. I didn't have discretion to... The megaliths are terraforming this planet because we're standing on it. The vault opened because I walked up to it. The creatures in the basin are killing every native organism they can reach because they think we're the invasion force they were built to reinforce. And your company is sending 200 more people into a system that treats human beings as activation codes. For the first time, he had nothing ready. His clauses, categories, and corrections failed him. Only breath against glass. I let him go. He straightened his suit, retrieved his tablet from the floor, and rebuilt himself around silence. Barlow looked between us. Can we stop the beacon? I turned to Grady, who was hunched over his atmospheric station in the far corner, monitoring the cascade of data from the expanding oxygen zone. Dennis, the transmission from 12 Spire. Any way to interrupt it? Grady shook his head. The frequency is outside anything our communications array can generate or jam. The power output is orders of magnitude above our equipment. Even if I could build something to interfere, the signal has been broadcasting for over 3 hours. At light speed, it's already 3 light hours deep into interstellar space, and I'm picking up resonance harmonics from the other activated megaliths. They're amplifying the broadcast through their own spires. Shutting down one wouldn't matter. The ship's transmitter, I said. Can we at least disable our own uplink? Prevent Palladian from sending more deployment orders through us. Barlow and I severed the base camp's long-range communication relay within 20 minutes, physically, with cutting tools, pulling the antenna cable from its mounting and disconnecting the power feed. The Kermode would lose contact with us, which meant Palladian would lose contact with the Kermode's surface relay. It was crude, and it would buy almost nothing against the real problem. The beacon from Megalith 12 was broadcasting on a frequency that had nothing to do with human infrastructure. It was calling across distances our species had not crossed yet, to installations we had not found, on a channel that was old when the first primates were still climbing trees on a blue planet 62 light-years away. I stood outside the operations shelter and looked down at the basin. The oxygen zone now covered everything I could see. The air beyond my visor was warm, clear, and breathable. 7 megaliths stood open against a sky losing its amber cast, the methane haze thinning by the hour as the vented atmosphere displaced the native gas mixture. The war organisms squatted in their loose perimeter around the base of the plateau, motionless, faces turned upward toward the camp. The native ground cover was gone. Every mat, every root fan, every burrower and chitinous ground crawler within the operational radius. The planet's surface, in every direction the terraforming reached, was bare rock and clean air and silence. Barlow came out of the shelter and stood beside me. Foss sat on the ground near the airlock, suit light off, visor dimmed, staring at nothing. "The Briggs is 11 days out," Barlow said. 212 people. I know. We can't stop them from landing. We can't stop the megaliths. We can't stop the beacon." He paused. "What are we supposed to do, Ray?" I unlatched my helmet. The seal broke with a soft hiss. I lifted the helmet off my head and held it at my side, and the air of Coronis 7B touched my face for the first time. Warm, clean, oxygen-rich, perfectly calibrated for the architecture of my lungs. I breathed in, and the breath came easy. The temperature was comfortable. The humidity was right. 62 light-years from Earth, standing on a world whose original inhabitants had dug trenches to stop what I am, and the air was perfect. Engineered for me by beings who had engineered me first. The atmosphere of a conquered planet, produced by machines that recognized my body as authorization and my presence as proof of successful delivery. Below us, the war organisms detected the change. My exposed skin, my unfiltered breath, the chemical signature of a living human body open to the air. They stirred. They stood. They turned their faces toward me with an attention that looked like the ancient loyalty of a weapon that has finally found the hand it was made for. The beacon burned above Megalith 12, a pale column of light climbing into a sky that grew bluer by the hour. Somewhere on worlds I had never heard of, other megaliths were receiving the signal. The program was running. The lineage had arrived. I stood in the air that was made for me and breathed.